slide. So living machines, and in some sense, I would like to shift gears a little bit and also look more at this idea of what's intelligence in from the perspective of living machines. What are the next steps? What are our challenges? Because with living machines, we might think more at the surface features of a robot, but we actually really have to worry about the control of that robot, because otherwise it's just an empty shell. And so the work I'm talking about is done by many people in my research group, and of course our collaborators outside. So this is teamwork, this is team science. That's what we need to advance the living machines agenda. So I will first give a little bit a conceptual framing of what we're doing, but also to highlight this core challenge I see in the science of mind and brain, which is really to grasp intention, to grasp volition, to grasp meaning. So this is what we're trying to do, and this is where I think the living machines approach gives us the most leverage. And then I will go through concrete examples of how we have pushed that agenda in relation to neuroscience, in relation to the construction of embodied models of cognition, and then also back again into human intracranial physiology. So for me, living machines in that sense also really part of an empirical cycle of theorizing, modeling, predicting, and then again going back to the empirical assessment of validation of these predictions, right? So a very good example is Gray Walter, who in the 40s, 50s, 60s, also as a neurophysiologist, got very much engaged with cybernetics, areas of control, that he also was aiming to test by construction, right? So use synthetic methods to validate these models of behavior that he envisioned in this famous turtles, or that, however, of course, would have some scalability issues because they're not so easily programmable. But if you think about the technology they had available at the time, what they achieved and the concepts that they validated with that were absolutely amazing. But now, Gray Walter was also a physiologist and wrote books on the living brain, where he was also speculating about what does it take to reconstruct the brain with artificial elements. So, but in this perspective of cybernetics, I think it's also really important that we have to place that into historical context. As we see the AI revolution around us, and often the time constant of people's memory of the field is relatively short. And as you know, if you can't remember the past, you might be condemned to repeat it. Or as Kurt Vonnegut would have it, we're going to repeat it anyway, because that's what it means to be alive. But I think to contextualize a bit where living machine stands in this bigger picture could help us. So here we have Gray Walter, but he's actually part of a much more extensive loop of different stages in the study of mind and brain, which involves many actors. Here is a very small subset of these actors. But of course, it goes back to the classics in the fundamental debate about reason versus the senses, right? Rationalism versus empiricism. And the first studies of the experimental study of the mind and in relation to the brain in the 19th century, where the core objective was to understand experience and consciousness. But this got superseded by behaviorism because there was a sense like this lacks method, this lacks the scientific method that we know from physics. So maybe we should downscale our ambition about these internal features of minds, such as consciousness and experience, and focus on stuff we can measure. And that then became a battlefield from which spawned, after the Second World, two approaches: one, cybernetics, emphasis on control, on synthesis, and on the other hand, the idea of cognitivism and the computer metaphor, or a disembodied mind. So in that sense, we went from the empty organism of behaviorism, fully controlled, to the disembodied mind of the computer. And after that, so the late 80s and early 90s, we saw people jumped onto a biological metaphor of artificial life, connectionism, neural networks. And as the general trend in this progression over 150 years has been very much to replace one paradigm with the next. And I think there sits one of the problems, and there sits one of the opportunities we have with the living machines approach, because actually each of these considerations, each of these steps has something important to say. So to replace the methodological rigor of behaviorism with the rules and representations of cognitivism is not necessarily progress if you sacrifice your experimental rigor, right? So this is where I see the big cost that we have paid. We have lost our understanding of the intentionality of behavior, the goal-directedness of behavior. Also in Holger's case, you see the flies. We describe and try to understand their behavior in terms of the behavioral goals they have. But overall, in this progression, we have lost a grasp on understanding these internal complex features of minds. And I think their living machines can really get us back on track. So this has been the fundamental debate across this whole mind-brain behavior cycle. On the one hand, the attempt to build, if you want, a Newtonian physics of behavior, which led to the negation of the subjectivity of mind and its goals and intentions. We know the early cognitive behaviorists already in 1930s were speaking of a cognitive behaviorism. We have to consider these internal states. And that also became the demise of behaviorism, right? We could not explain behavior without resorting to assumptions about the internal states, such as motivational states or learning experience. But we have not really built methods around this. How do we measure these internal states? How can we understand them? And that's where the synthetic method of living machines can help us. So how I see the approach we're following, and that's also, in my case, the program, the living machine program framework allows us to bring the strength of these different approaches together without negating them. But we make them stronger. We allow to think about, let's say, behavior in terms of the intelligence behind it. These are not exclusive categories, right? So the living machines approach allows us to bring these elements together because the synthetic method to rebuild and emulate allows us new forms of empirical assessment. So this is what I'm after. I want to understand how can we explain and understand intention and meaning in a deterministic universe. That's what the physicists tell us, right? And this is where I think living machines can help us. And I would like to give you a progress report. So how far did we get? The starting point for me was this fundamental transition that we saw in the late 80s from a symbolic artificial intelligence to the more biologically inspired artificial intelligence of connectionism, neural networks, and so on, was symbol grounding. Where does the meaning from a symbol come from? Right now, you would say, machine learning terms, how do we define the states of a behaving agent in a way that are autonomous with respect to that agent, so not imposed by the external designer? So for that, I started to work with control structures like distributed adaptive control that would help us to generate foraging behavior in a way that we can compare to that we might observe in rodents. And the idea was to think about control of behavior as indeed in multi-layer terms. We have fast systems, robust, but they're somewhat simple, and then we have slower systems that are memory intense, that can learn, and that can adjust policies to reward contingencies. And then what we already showed quite early on is that actually there are multiple control loops playing an important role in these multi-layered control architectures. And in this specific case, what we showed, actually, if I learn my policies at a high level of representation, this automatically leads to the structuring of behavior. If I have behavioral habits, I will start to define an effective environment in which I operate, which is a subset of all possible interactions I can have. But this bias will in turn translate to the filters, to the internal adaptive filters I'm building to classify and interpret that environment, right? So there are multiple loops of interaction in such a control architecture between layers, but also through behavior itself. So then, if you look at this multi-layered control architecture as a hypothesis, we also have been mapping that to specific structures in the brain. So, but what is interesting to see is in all cases, you see a triad of representations. You always deal with representations of the world, representations of the self, and then action. Action in the end is an interface between the self and the world. So for instance, if you look at these very fast, simple and reactive control systems, the world would be represented by the superior colliculus in the vertebrate brain or the mammalian brain, the self by the hypothalamus, and the action system by the central gray, right? If we go to higher levels of control in the prefrontal cortex, so that we jump a layer, you can look at interaction with prefrontal cortex, the working memory systems of decision-making, the insula and the orbital frontal cortex that we know represent states of the self at a very high level, and action, supplementary motor areas, and primary, pre and primary motor areas, right? So in every case, we see this triad. So this has been our working hypothesis, but what are the core organizing principles behind that? And here, and this also speaks to what Tony mentioned earlier, how can we think of these layers of control? Well, the point is the brain in this multi-layered perspective is operating in a way to satisfy multiple criteria. The brain doesn't optimize one thing, it must optimize multiple things. So it always has to move the control policy along a trade-off boundary. For instance, it has to be robust in certain cases and quick, while in other cases it might have to deal with complex tasks that require a lot of learning and attempts. However, if you're slow, you might not survive when there are certain exceptions, right? So the multi-layered control structure, I'm going to get back to this later with some empirical evidence, actually tells us that the brain is not only a multi-layered control architecture, it is a multi-layered control architecture that continuously dynamically configures itself to tune its performance to the specific trade-off boundaries that it has to address. So how do you make these ideas testable? So here you see a visual representation of the multi-layered control system, but we can also summarize it like this. The fundamental insight that came out of that was that if we think about the decision-making of a multi-layered control architecture, actually, we have to consider at least 4 factors. This was the prediction we made, and we showed if you make that assumption in these foraging tasks that I just showed you, you have Bayesian optimal performance. That means on the one hand, you have to consider your perceptual evidence. What's the world telling me? What are the affordances in the world around me? Then you want to rely on your memory biases to say, look, I know a structure in the world that I can exploit. There are your goals. The goals might have varying priorities, and there's value. What is the expected outcome if I pursue a certain course of action? So the fundamental claim we make here is that optimal performance is actually optimizing along these 4 factors, but also what I showed you earlier, an underlying assumption was the idea that to make that work, the optimization process is operating on integrated sensory motor representations. Now that was or conjunctive representations. It seemed a strong assumption because if I have to work on my perceptual evidence and memory biases, if I have separated my perceptual and action representations, I have to find ways to link them back together again. And the assumption that we inserted in this model was to say, well, maybe the unit of representation is already multimodal and linked sensory motor states. Now that became a testable prediction, right? So, so as any scientific theory, right, we have to satisfy 3 criteria. We have to explain stuff, make testable predictions, and show an ability to control states of the world. So how can we now find explanations for this idea of conjunctive representations that we assumed were fundamental? Well, here I spoke with my dear friend, the late John Lisman, and John Lisman had a brilliant insight where he said, well, you know, these conjunctive representations might sound very problematic, but if you look at the core circuit of the memory the memory systems of the brain, the hippocampus, I will say a few more words about it later, actually at the input stage, it's called the entorhinal cortex, you see a very clear separation between inputs that relate to perception and sensory states and those that relate to action. So possibly these conjunctive representations occur inside the hippocampal memory system. So here we had a testable prediction that we pursued. And with that, of course, we're looking at the memory systems that underlie our ability to form memories we can recall, that are integrative, or also called episodic memory, that of course we know from the many clinical studies around this, starting with the famous Henry Gustav Meissen, the famous patient HM, where these structures were lesioned to overcome his epilepsy, and that which led to severe deficits in episodic memory. So we looked at the structure, but then the next question is, of course, what's your benchmark and how are we going to test this idea that John Listman had? Well, the hippocampus, if you make a cross section here through this banana, has a very particular organization in a feed-forward sense, right? You have a cortical input from the entorhinal cortex, deep layers, going to the so-called dentate gyrus. From there, via the mossy fibers, it goes through cortical motor 3 or CA3, then it goes to CA1 and out again to the superficial layers of the entorhinal cortex. So it's a loop. And indeed, if you roll out the cortex, the hippocampus is like the loop that sits at the end of that cortical sheet. So the cortex looping back upon itself through the hippocampus. And if you measure from CA1 here, visualized in our diagram here, and we measure from a single neuron and we just plot that cell's activity relative to the position of the animal in the space, we get the famous place cells that many of you will be familiar with, right? So we know the hippocampus already, according to O'Keefe and Nadel, is in the end forming maps of the environment through building these kinds of representations of space. If you group this together in populations, you have a map. In addition, what these cells can do, which is actually extremely interesting because it speaks to this whole issue of disconnecting from physical now. Johnson and Radish already showed a while back that as the rat navigates through an environment and it reaches decision points, as you just saw, here we plot with every little rectangle the activity of such a place cell and its preferred position. And what you see happening here is as the animal reaches a decision point, you see a sweep in both directions before the animal makes a decision, right? So this has also been called mental time travel. So this memory system is also used to start to make predictions about future trajectories and what they might lead to. So now, conjunctive representations. Is this also indeed built in this circuit? Well, when we started to address this question, so now we talk 2010, so it's some time ago, but it builds up to a longer story. There was a conundrum in the field because there was this belief that these are attractor memories that exist in the hippocampus. So if I would smoothly change an environment and I would measure activity of the memories in that system, I should see a rapid transition between different memory states. So Lord Gapp et al., this is the lab of Edward Moser, slowly changed an environment from rectangular to circular and then measured both in the CA3 area, so this first input stage of the hippocampus, so we're looking at this part here, and the dentate gyrus, the input stage. And what they then did, as they morphed the environment, they made a vector representation of the population response, and they just looked at what's the correlation between these vectors of responses when I'm morphing the environment. And to their surprise, what they saw was a smooth degradation of this correlation. That means if I have small differences between environments, I see a small degradation of this correlation. So for this hippocampal response, that means the world is also smoothly varying. And that seemed very surprising because these two environments are rather similar. So if it's an attractor memory, it would still give you the same response, but apparently not. So We explained this through a model following John's proposal, because now if conjunctive representations happen in this system, then that means even though the sensory states are very similar, the change between the two environments might be minimal. In terms of the action states that are afforded, they might be different. The way I move through this environment might be different, right? So the question then became, is action having any impact on this degradation of the population vector? And in that way, would that then prove the idea of the conjunctive representation? So we built a detailed model with Cesar Reno Costa, obeying all the known physiology and anatomy. And what we showed is that if you have a mixing factor of 0.3, that means 30% of the input reflects your actions and 70% reflects the sensory state that pertains to the environment, you can exactly account for this smooth degradation of the population vector. Right? So in this way, using this benchmark of morphing, we showed that it's actually reflecting the conjunctive representations that the hippocampus is forming. So this is a signature that hippocampus is multiplexing information. When a neuron fires, it's actually telling you something about both sensory states and the actions. So then the Moser lab responded to this by lesioning the lateral entorhinal cortex with the idea that that should degrade this response, and this then was confirmed. So we found further empirical support for that idea. But now we want to go one step further and show that we have an ability to also control these features by placing them in an embodied model. So this was one version of that, but so this was a simple foraging task where we have a robot that has to forage for different targets. Let's call them food and water, red and blue. There are certain sensory cues and there's a home location. So this is what the robot would see in these different positions. Then first we build up similar place cells as I showed you earlier. So here we have specific responses to locations in space that we learned through this integration of also the sensory and the motor responses. But on top of that, what we also could show is that this robot, using this memory model, would perform similar mental time travel, serving its decision making, as was reported earlier by Johnson and Reddish. So we have a multi-layered control architecture, which is explaining optimal foraging for single agents. It makes fundamental assumptions about conjunctive representations, and then we went back to test those empirically, and the outcome of that, again, we then validated in this embodied model. Okay, this is the robot in action. Now this starts to show one feature of this living machines approach I was describing to you, because now I can interpret these memory states of the machine because we controlled its full history, right? So as this robot makes these sweeps through its memory system to make predictions about future trajectories, we have the ability to interpret these and to also know exactly to which states of the environment these belong, right? So the living machines approach now gives us the ability to do something that the behaviorists had great difficulties with, which is how do I, in a controlled way, observe these internal states? Well, now we can do it because we have synthesized them. Okay, subsequently, we have elaborated this model further. I will not expand on this, but it's a recent paper in Trends in Cognitive Science, where we showed that this model of the hippocampus has another really relevant feature, which is something you can call epistemic autonomy, right? So it's a symbol grounding problem. Where does the information, the knowledge come from? We've shown that this hippocampal learning circuit is actually self-guided, right? So that at the entorhinal cortical end, there's a comparator, it generates error signals, and that error signals can be seen as setting up a gradient of learning in the hippocampal loop. But this is, if you have an interest in that, ask me later, we get back to it, because we want to test our predictions now on what does this mean with respect to goal-oriented behavior. So for that, we went to the human brain. So we have some understanding now of this hippocampal memory circuit. And the insight we had was to say, well, actually, action itself is a very strong modulator of how memories are formed. And this is indirectly reflected, for instance, in this morphing experiment from Lloyd-Kapp et al. that we replicated and also explained in terms of conjunctive representations. But now, what's the role of action in the formation of human memory? So for that, so we said action modulates the formation of memory. So we had the opportunity with Rodrigo Rocamora from the epilepsy unit at Hospital Del Mar here in Barcelona to actually do experiments with epilepsy patients where we could further push the envelope on this specific question of how voluntary action modulates memory and performance. So these are patients that are in hospital to be monitored for the epilepsy in order to identify the locations in the brain that are epileptogenic, that generate their seizures, so to be removed. And this you see on the top part of this plot here, the context we have in this specific brain. And we would put these subjects, the participants, in a virtual reality maze because we need action. But in the maze, they were asked to go to the red ball. And then at the position of the red ball, they were shown an image at some location on the wall. And they were just asked to remember that image. Okay, so later, but what you can see, of course, now we can start to dissociate location from the item, the image that we showed them. And that's, of course, what we wanted. So then in the retrieval trial, we place people in certain rooms. The room might be new, right? The textures of the room might be new. They might never have seen it before. And in that room, we will show them a picture, and also that picture could be new. So now we can look at the role of location in the maze and how this modulates the recall of a specific item. So then in order to make this testable, we used a method that's called reinstatement analysis, which is very elegant. And what it does actually is you have your contexts in the brain. So here you have your time series. Then you take your power spectrum of this time series over a certain time interval. And then you start to bin this information so that you take a slice of the power spectrum at certain time bins as your descriptor of the state of that contact. So basically what we're now looking at is the oscillatory activity of the brain. And since it's for encoding and retrieval, you can just say, okay, are these patterns of oscillation that I encounter in the encoding of the stimulus, do they also reoccur when I'm retrieving the same stimulus, right? So now we can start to look at the response of the brain, both when it's encoding and retrieving a certain stimulus. And metaphorically, you can compare it to a choir, right? The choir has a number of voices. The voices put out certain frequencies. And basically you're saying, as at this point in time during the encoding, is the choir singing the same song? Or has the song maybe been shifted in time? Or has it been compressed in some way? But this is essentially what you're looking for using a correlation-based approach. So the first thing we saw now is that if you just compare occasions where the location where you remember something and the item is congruent, so you see it in the same spot where you saw it before, and you compare that to incongruent events, there's a significant effect for the congruent case at around 1.5 to 3 seconds in encoding and around stimulus onset at retrieval. So what does it mean? The song that the brain is playing at encoding, starting at 1.5 seconds, is replayed in a compressed way immediately at stimulus onset if you're in the same room seeing the same thing. Okay. Now, this was for us very exciting because you see also a time warping, right? So the representation, which is the oscillatory activity, is regenerated very shortly after stimulus onset, which suggests there's a virtualization of this representation, right? It does not depend really on the outside world, but it's internally generated. Then we looked at, okay, so let's skip this one, also in the service of time. Then we went one step further because, so now with this, if you want, we tested the method, right? We showed, look, we can pick out the dynamic signatures of stimuli and locations in the hippocampus and the cortex, and we show that these are significantly different between congruent location item associations as incongruent ones. But now we want to manipulate action, right? So what we did now is subjects were again put in the maze where they could navigate using a joystick, but there were two types of blocks. On the one hand, they could control themselves where they were going, or they were on the trajectory of somebody else, which is called yoked control, right? So now I cannot choose where I'm going. I'm just going, okay? But the trajectory is still plausible. So, we interleave that for every subject. So this is the example, right? So here we are navigating. These are the signals we get from the different contexts in the brain of this patient, but we have several dozen more for every patient. And here you get an idea of the correlation structure in these different contexts. But this is the kind of information that we worked with. But then again, we pose this question: if I use this frequency analysis, this encoding recall similarity analysis, what happens to the quality of this similarity when I can act myself versus when I cannot act myself? So first, if you look at the performance itself in recollection, so if you compare the quality of the recollection in terms of the remembering between volitional trials and passive trials, there's a significant difference. So people remember better under conditions of volition. This is a known effect, but we replicated that also with our patients. So this is important that the patients behave like healthy controls. And now to the specific dynamical changes of action. The one thing we saw is that the active humans, so usually when you analyze these types of signals or intracranial EEG signals, you would look at certain frequency bands, right? Like listed here from delta to gamma, and they define certain ranges. We know that in the hippocampus, this so-called theta range is very dominant, 4 to 8 hertz. And what we see to start with is that this band is strongly enhanced in the active trials, right? So when you have volition, when you can choose to act, you see an activation of this memory system, which might, now speculating, but that might underlie also the quality in recollection because you drive memory better. Now, if we now apply this encoding retrieval similarity analysis, we also see that there the correlation is enhanced, is higher between these states of the brain at encoding and retrieval in the volitional trials and in the passive trials, right? So the song the brain sings is more similar when you have volition. And this is now in more detail unpacked. So here we look at, we remove the Theta oscillations because they're very dominant, and we just pose them the question, okay, when I have the same item or a different item, right? How is this differently encoding between these two conditions? And you see that also here we found a very significant difference between the encoding of same and different items between the volition case versus the passive case. So, so what did this show so far? Right, so we wanted to understand first conjunctive representations and the impact of action itself and volition, because this was the thing we tried to recover on memory, performance, and experience, right? We see that in terms of the encoding the brain forms, there's a very significant effect of volition on the dynamic signature. So it's also important to understand, right? We don't look just at the rates of firing, like how much energy does the cell emit. We really look at what are the specific frequencies that they fire at and how do these frequencies reoccur. But another issue that I raised earlier was, well, architectures are dynamically reconfigured dependent on task demand. So for that, we did another analysis on the same data where we looked at information measures, conditional entropy in this case, across all the signals we captured. And we just posed a simple question in informational terms. Is the relationship between all these contexts that we have in the brain different between the active and the passive state when there's volition or no volition? And what we see is here you see over time for a single patient in a single block, and here we have conditional entropy, that the conditional entropy is radically different across the two conditions. So very suggestive of this idea of dynamic reconfiguration of the information architecture of the brain dependent on task demands. Do I have to make decisions, or do I just follow whatever is presented to me? Okay, so, and this is of course something we are also further looking into. So what did I try to get across here? First, so living machines is for me a methodology, an approach that helps us to through synthetic methods or through a synthetic psychology, bring these different perspectives on mind and brain together without getting stuck in notions of exclusivity, to say, well, it must be either this or that, but it cannot be integrated. Embodiment, for instance, the notions of, let's say, morphological computation are very relevant in understanding cognition. So they don't have to negate notions of high-level representations and reasoning. But how do you bring those together in an integrated way? So this is what living machines helps us to do. And my specific angle into that was to say, well, I want to understand how this architecture operates as a bootstrapped system that acquires its own knowledge and then uses that to achieve its own goals and improving its policies over time. And what our emphasis there was is how do we recover these notions of volition and intentionality of behavior? And what I try to illustrate here is that through this cycle of living machine approaches, where we say we have models give us hypotheses, we can test these hypotheses again in the empirical domain, which give us new constructs we can then validate in our embodied models. From there, we can make a next round of empirical validation. We actually have at least started to scratch the surface on making volition and intention, again, measurable elements in our understanding of mind and brain in this sort of living machine synthetic psychology that I think is also really the future for the robot-related living machines. Because if we ever want to really collaborate with robots, they must have these kinds of capabilities of deciding, of understanding, and also choosing between actions that are ethically well-grounded versus those that are not. So these are essential capabilities we have to give to future technology. And that's, of course, a second spin-off that living machines can give us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a really great talk. And thank you for finishing on time, actually slightly early, which
it's against my habits. That's against my habits.
So
I have a few more backup slides.
No, I think you've given us enough to think about. So everybody, there is a button at the bottom of your screen called Reactions. And on that button, there's a thing called Raise Hand. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and if I ask you to ask your question, please turn on your video and your sound. So does anybody have a question for Paul? Please raise a hand. Okay, Stefan, I think I can see your hand raised. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk, and nice seeing you again after a long time. One thing I really liked in what you researched is this aspect of volition, and I relate that to one problem that I think a lot about, which is free will. Like, is it something that, how can we explore free will in a deterministic universe? And the approach of living machine, so far we've been creating living machine that represents a mental state, right? We are trying to build a brain of a robot that acts in the world. And then we say, okay, we can now look at the internal state of this machine and make hypotheses about our own internal states and so on. With the kind of machine learning system that we have today, we could create an external system that predicts the action of a biological being. Let's say, for example, a recommendation system or something that will tell if you're gonna click on a YouTube video or on an ad or something. And there we don't have anything to tell about your internal system as a biological being, but we have the internal system of the machine. In this case, like, do you see any way to integrate this notion of volition in such a system? Like, where does the volition of the biological being stay when we have a system that can predict its action?
Well, but your predictions are not necessarily 100% accurate, and or accuracy is also traded off versus the very simplicity of the task space, right? You have very few states you have to make predictions about. By the way, Stefan, good to see you. Sorry, I started in the wrong way. Good that you're here. But so I think on the one hand, we have to question a little bit how accurate these predictions are. But on the other hand, human behavior can be influenced. And we also know that. And in small task spaces, I'm not surprised that volition doesn't play a big role. But what does volition really mean? It also means that you know you could have done something else. And you could also ask a person that you're, let's say, reason responsive, right? If you explain someone, look, maybe this is not the best course of action, they can change that action. So I think the fundamental question is not, can we predict behavior, right? But that's more a necessary condition. I think it's also about, can you really know and can you truly say that you could have done something else? If that's not true, then really everything is deterministic and free will is an illusion. But I don't think that to be true. I think given the highly also nonlinear aspects of brains, they can generate novelty, they can generate alternative courses of action. But sometimes, of course, the external constraints are such that the outcome can be only one. So it's also balancing between the ability of generating novel action and knowing you could have done something else, and environmental incentives, right? If I say, look, I give you $1 million when you agree with me. Well, anyway, with your employer, maybe that doesn't matter anymore to you, but I give you $1 billion when you agree with me. There will be a point that you will just agree with me and say, you see, I can predict this behavior. It's also a matter of the incentives that we're talking about, complexity of the task space. So I think there's space for free will here. It's just snowed under this onslaught of behaviorist certitude that we still see too much of today.
I think we've got time for one more question. Nathan, do you want to ask a quick question?
Thanks. So I really enjoyed that, Paul. Thanks. I like this picture you've got up, which is useful because this is what I wanted to ask a question about. And I liked your kind of historical perspective on, I guess, human intelligence. I guess this is paradigms for it. So your arrow points at saying now. So what's next? Is it back to consciousness? Is that what everybody's going to be doing?
Yep, that's it.
And you're saying big data, that's the wrong way to go.
Exactly, waste of time.
I thought that might be your perspective.
Yeah.
Do you want to say any more about that, or is that it?
Well, the big data is a little bit the trap we're falling into now, because we discovered that data is easy to get, and we have great methods to look. If you look at the newest language systems from OpenAI, right? They have billions of parameters. Of course, that's complete madness, unexplainable. It does stuff by magic, but programmed in ways we cannot comprehend. That's the big data approach. We're not explaining anything. We're not predicting anything. We're not controlling anything. We violate basic notions of science and building theories in science. So this is why it is an intellectual collapse, if you want to go that route. There are lots of smart people active there, but we're not gaining any new insights. Well, I think we just have to re-enter the cycle, but now bring these elements together. This is where the big intellectual gains are, also the scientific gains, as far as I'm concerned.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think there's lots of food for thought, and we'll come back to many of these topics in the discussion. But we do need to move on. And